Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We are holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav and we will be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Kuf Beis Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Sukkah and we pick up today on Kuf Beis Amid Aleph near the bottom in the middle of Siman Taf Reish Lamed Ches Sif Beis with the words of the Ramah, 2 lines from the bottom in the parentheses Ubiyom Tov V'Shabbos. So just to remind you, we have been speaking about the Isser, the prohibition, to derive certain types of benefit from the Atzei HaSukkah, from the materials that the Sukkah is built out of, and from the decorations of the Sukkah, from the Noye Sukkah. So here in Sif Beis is where the Mechaber introduced to us the Isser of using the decorations of the Sukkah. For example, if you are to have jars of honey or jars of flour hanging from the schach in the sukkah, you're not allowed to take honey for your tea. You're not allowed to say, oh, I'm short a quarter of a cup of flour for something I'm baking on Chol HaMoed. I'll take some flour from the schach, from the noi sukkah that are hanging from the schach to bake my cake. You're not allowed to do this, the Mishnah Berurah told us in Ois Katan Yud Beis, the bizui hula mitzvah kishamistapek mehem. This is a bizui mitzvah. It's an improper way to treat the mitzvah. You're treating the mitzvah in a derogatory fashion by going ahead and taking honey for your tea or taking flour for your cake. This is not really the same as the prohibition that we saw in the beginning of this Siman, where you're not allowed to make use of the materials that the sukkah is built out of. That, we said, is actually, according to many Rishonim, Isser Daraisa. That's based on the comparison that the Torah HaTorah makes between the materials of the Sukkah and a carbon chagiga. And we saw that the same way when you're magdish a behema for a carbon, it gets a kedusha, and now there's an Isser of a me'ilah. You're not allowed to go derive benefit from that animal. So too by the materials of the Sukkah, once you designate it and use it for the mitzvah of Sukkah, you're no longer allowed to make use of it for something else. That would be an Isser Daraisa. We've also been dealing with the Isser of Muktzah. Over here, we're talking about the Noye Sukkah. You're not allowed to derive any other use. You're not allowed to be mistapek. Doesn't mean that there's an Isser Tiltal. Now, there may be an Isser Tiltal on Yom Tov proper. On Yom Tov, to go touch and move the Noye Sukkah, that would be an Isser of Muktzah. This Isser that we're talking about here, Asr Lihistapek Mehem, is an Isser that you're not allowed to use them. You're not allowed to take honey. You're not allowed to take flour. That's the Isser of the Bizoi Mitzvah. Now in the parentheses, the Ramah says, Ubiyom Tov V'Shabbos Asr L'taltalam the Muktzim Heim. On Yom Tov proper and on Shabbos of Sukkot, then there's an Isser Tiltal. So again, you see over here, we're dealing with 2 different Isurim. There's one Isser that you're not allowed to be mistapek from your Noye Sukkah. You're not allowed to take honey. You're not allowed to take flour, because that's a Bizoi Mitzvah. That's one Isser. But now there's another Isser, and that is that on Yom Tov and Shabbos, the Noye Sukkah, the decorations, are Muktzah. Why are they Muktzah? Because they're not Muchan. They're not prepared for any other use on Shabbos of Sukkot and on Yom Tov of Sukkot. That jar of honey that's hanging from the schach, or that tinfoil decoration that's hanging from the schach, is huktzah l'mitzvasai. You set it aside to be noi sukkah. You set it aside to be in the sukkah as a decoration. And you are makti it midaitai. You removed it from your mind. You had no thought to use it for any other use for the duration of Shabbos, the duration of Yom Tov, and therefore on Yom Tov and Shabbos, it's muktzah like anything else that's muktzah. And therefore there's an Isser Tiltal. There's an Isser to touch it, to move it. That's the Isser of muktzah. The other Isser that we spoke about, Bizoi Mitzvah, there would be no Isser, let's say on Chol HaMoed, to move the jar of honey hanging on the schach. That's not a problem of Bizoi Mitzvah, to move it. The Isser of Bizoi Mitzvah is to take honey from it. So on Chol HaMoed, the only Isser that there is the Isser of Bizoi Mitzvah. You can't use it for something else. But on Yom Tov proper, or on Shabbos of Yom Tov, there's an additional Isser, which is that now that jar of honey is Muktzah. because it has no other available Shabbos or Yom Tov use. Muktzah is aser b'tiltul. You're not allowed to move muktzah. So now you're not even allowed to touch and move that jar of honey or that foil decoration or those plastic fruits that are hanging from the schach. It's forbidden to touch. I skipped. Ois cutting your dalit. Ubi Yom Tov Shabbos, and Yom Tov Shabbos there's an issur of tiltul. The Rama said, Ava Chol HaMoed leishayich is a tiltul. But like I just explained to you, there would be no issur of tiltul of the Noi Sukkah on Chol HaMoed, because there is no issur of muktzah on Chol HaMoed. The only issur is the issur of bizay mitzvah. And now is a very important line in the Mishnah Berurah, which some people often wonder about on Sukkahs. Val Kain. Therefore, since it's true that on Chol HaMoed there is no issur of tiltul, there's only an issur of bizay mitzvah. Im naflu, if your beautiful poster, your beautiful ushpizin poster, fell off the wall on Chol HaMoed, mutar l'taltalan, you're allowed to move it, you're allowed to handle it, ulahakziran l'mekaiman, and you could take it back and refasten it to the wall. Because again, on Chol HaMoed there is no issur tiltul. There's only an issur of bizay mitzvah, and it's certainly not bizay mitzvah to take the poster and hang it back up in its proper place. However, on Shabbos or Yom Tov proper, then the Ramah said also l'taltalam, then you're not allowed to handle the Noi Sukkah in any way. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Hainu afilu lodas hamatirin le'el b'simin taf tzadikei muktzah b'yom tov k'moi b'Shabbos. If you remember, we're not going to go into it now, but when we were learning Hilchas Yom Tov, we found that there are shitos that are more machmir on muktzah on Yom Tov than on Shabbos. There are types of muktzah, categories of muktzah that they're more machmir on Yom Tov than on Shabbos, because Yom Tov needs more chizuk. Since on Yom Tov we have certain heterim, we have Eichel Nefesh is mutter, cooking is mutter, Havara L'Tzarech is mutter. So when it came to muktzah, in certain categories there were more machmir on muktzah on Yom Tov than on Shabbos. What the Chavetz Chaim is pointing out over here is this muktzah that we're discussing when it comes to the Noyei Sukkah. This muktzah would apply even according to the shitais that are more mekel, the ones that are not machmir on Yom Tov. They would also agree that this is a type of muktzah that's muktzah on Yom Tov. But muktzah kazeh, this type of muktzah, the type of muktzah that applies to the Noyei Sukkah, lekule alma osur. Everybody would agree that the Noyei Sukkah are muktzah and also betiltul to huktzu l'mitzvasam, because you are totally maktzeh the Noyei Sukkah midaitoi. You totally remove them from your mind because they're huktzu l'mitzvasai. You designated them for the mitzvah of zekeli vanveu of Noyei Sukkah, and you removed from your mind the idea of using them for anything else. That's similar to being maktzeh something biyodayim, to physically setting something aside and saying, I will not use these for Yom Tov. Like if you have apples that you put away for schera. You bundled up apples and you put them away. And you said, these are for schera, these are for business, I'm selling these. Those are muktzah, you are maktzeh them biyodayim. So too over here, the Noyei Sukkah is a very stringent form of muktzah, and everybody would agree that they are muktzah on Yom Tov proper, and they're aser betiltul. Okay, let's go weiter. 2 lines from the bottom, near the end of the line in the Mechaber. So, we've said that the Noyei Sukkah have this prohibition, both of bizay mitzvah and on Yom Tov and on Shabbos of muktzah. Says the Mechaber, if you made a condition at the time that you hung them up, and we'll have to see what that means, but you made a condition. What is this condition? Explains the Mechaber, Va'amar, and you said, Eini boidel mehen, I am not separating myself from these items. So, you have this jar of honey that you're about to hang up in the sukkah. But before you hang it up, you make it tanai. You set a condition. And you say, Eini boidel mehen, I'm not separating myself from this honey. The problem of the prohibition is that when you hang up a jar of honey for Noyei Sukkah, you are designating it as a dvar mitzvah, as a chefet shel mitzvah. You're designating it as something that you're setting aside to beautify your sukkah. And that brings with it two problems. Not problems, but two issues. One is, now you've sort of designated it as a heftzah shel mitzvah, and now to take a teaspoon of honey out of there and use it for your tea would constitute bizui mitzvah. That's one issue. The other issue is the muktzah issue. By being maktzah it, by designating it for this idea, for this purpose of beautifying the mitzvah, you mentally separated yourself from any other usage. So now you create a muktzah issue. So those are the two issues that we have. But if you make a tanai, if you make a condition, and you say outright, Eini boidel mehen, I'm not separating myself. Don't think that I'm hanging up this jar of honey and I'm designating it as a heftzah shel mitzvah. Right now, I don't mind if it hangs from the schach and it beautifies the sukkah. But I am not designating it for that sole purpose. I have in my mind that should I desire to use it, should I need a teaspoon of honey, I fully intend on taking a teaspoon of honey. In that case, there really isn't a bizui mitzvah. The bizui mitzvah is, if you set it aside as a heftzah shel mitzvah, now you want to go ahead and you want to use the heftzah shel mitzvah for a teaspoon of honey for your tea, that's an issue of bizui mitzvah. But if you said very straight out when you did it, no, I'm not designating this as a heftzah shel mitzvah. Right now, it could serve a purpose of beautifying the sukkah. I need to keep it somewhere, so I'm going to hang it up over here. But I fully intend to use that honey over the course of Yom Tov if I need it. That takes care of the bizui shel mitzvah issue. It also takes care of the muktzah issue because you are not maktzah it midaitoi. You did not mentally remove it from any other purpose. You were very clear. I intend on using it for any purpose that I may have. Excuse me. Like I keep on saying, the beauties of seasonal allergies. So again, the Mechaber explains, you made it tonight. V'amar, and you said, Eini boidel mehen kol ben hashmashos. I'm not removing myself from this item, kol ben hashmashos, for the entirety of ben hashmashos, for the entirety of the twilight time period. And the Ramah puts in shel shmoina yomim. So I'm verbally stating every day of Yom Tov has a twilight period, as a Ben Hashmashos period, and I am not separating myself from this item for any of those twilight periods. Not the twilight period of the first day of Yom Tov, not the twilight period of the second day of Yom Tov, and we'll see why that's critical. But that's the Tanai that you made. We turn to Kuf Beis Amud Beis. Then says the Mechaber, Harei zeh mistapek mehem b'chol eis sheyirtzeh. If you made this Tanai, then you could use those noise sukkah items whenever you want. You need a teaspoon of honey, fine. You need a quarter of a cup of sugar, no problem. Not only that, but your foil decorations and your plastic esrogim and your plastic grapes would also not be aser b'tiltel on Yom Tov or on Shabbos. And again, the reason why they won't be aser b'tiltel is because they're not muktzah. They are mulchan. You actually verbally prepared them for use. You said, I'm going to use them if I need them. I'm not being maktzeh them idaitoi. Eini boidel mehen. I'm not separating myself from them. Well, in that case, then they're not muktzah, they're mulchan. So you took care of both issues by making this Tanai. And the Mechaber actually spells this out. The Mechaber says, why are they mutter? Sharei lo hiktzah isam. Because you did not designate them for the distinct and sole use of being nois sukkah. You didn't. You said, I'm not separating myself from them. V'lo chala aleim kedushas hasukkah. And I believe I'm right in the way that I'm reading the Mechaber here. Others might take issue with the way I'm reading the Mechaber, but I think I'm right. I hope I'm right. I'm aspal that I'm right. The Mechaber says, V'lo chala aleim kedushas hasukkah. They're not, the nois sukkah are not osir because of the Isser that we learned about in the beginning of Siman Tov Reish Lamed Ches. They don't have the Kedushas HaSukkah that they should be compared to a Karban Chagiga. We didn't learn that in the context of the Isser of Nois Sukkah. In the context of the Isser of Nois Sukkah, the Mishnah Berurah told us on Kuf Beis Amud Aleph in Ois Kat Yud Beis, the bizui hu lemitzvah kishem istapik mehem. The reason you can't be mistapek, the reason you can't use the honey, is not because of Karban Chagiga, it's not because of Kedushas HaSukkah, it's because of Bizay Mitzvah. So the Mechaber is telling me over here, there are no reasons to aser the Noi Sukkah if you made a Tanai. Why? One, Sharei Lo Hikza Oisam. You weren't makta them midaita, you didn't designate them as a chayfet shal mitzvah, and therefore they're not muktzah. Number two, v'loy chal aleim kedushas hasukah v'loy nechshavu k'maisa. The earlier isser that we spoke about, the hekesh to a karban chagiga, that doesn't apply to noi sukkah. It's not the material that the sukkah is made out of. It's only secondary to the sukkah. It's a decoration of the sukkah. It's a keli van veyu. We don't find that kedusha of sukkah applies to the noi sukkah. Says the Mechaber Weiter, but you should know there's a caveat here. And again, I believe that the Mechaber writes this line, V'loy chol aleim kedushas hasukah v'loy nechshavu k'moisa, to draw a very clear distinction between the noye sukkah and the atzei hasukah. Because if you remember, the Ramah told us on Kuf Aleph Amid Beis, 2 lines from the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch, on Kuf Aleph Amid Beis, the Ramah said, V'loy mahani ba t'nai. A t'nai is not efficacious when it comes to the materials of the sukkah. You can't make a t'nai. Now the reason you can't make a t'nai when it comes to the atzei sukkah is because you have a double problem when it comes to the atzei sukkah. First of all, once you designate it as being the materials for the sukkah, you have this din of the kedushas HaSukkah, the comparison to a karban chagiga. Then you have another problem. Even if you'll try to make a t'nai, and you'll say, I don't want to designate it for that use of kedushas HaSukkah, you have another problem, which is that immediately upon the arrival of Ben Hashmashas on the first night of Yom Tov, you could no longer take apart the sukkah because of stiras oil. Once you're prevented from taking apart the sukkah at Ben Hashmashas, so that at the arrival of Ben Hashmashas, the only purpose of this sukkah is to be a sukkah shel mitzvah. It has no other purpose because you can't take it down, you can't be mistapik from it, you can't use it for anything else, you can't take off a piece and use it as a toothpick because that would be stiras oil. So since you're prevented from using the sukkah for anything else, in that case it becomes a chefza shel mitzvah of a sukkah, and now the kedusha of sukkah is chal on it, and now you get this din that you're not allowed to be neneh from the atzei sukkah because it's compared to a karban chagiga. But over here, the Mechaber is pointing out that when it comes to the noi sukkah, you don't have the problem of the kedusha. That doesn't exist. The only problem you have is that you were maktzeh them. You were maktzeh them midaita at Ben Hashmashos. But if you weren't maktzeh them midaita at Ben Hashmashos, there's no problem of stiras ha'oil. So if you said before Ben Hashmashos, I'm not removing myself from this jar of honey, so then immediately upon the arrival of Ben Hashmashos, even at that first moment, you could use it for a teaspoon of honey for your tea. Why? Because there's no isser of stiras ha'oil. And you said I'm not designating it only as a chefza shel mitzvah. So again, there's no reason at all. If you make the t'nai, there's no reason at all why these items should be usher. However, says the Mechaber, second line down the middle of the line, v'davke shemasta b'zeh haloshen. However, you have to make the t'nai using exactly the phraseology that the Mechaber gave you. Avol, however, if somebody would say something a little different, then he would say, Ani masna aleihem la'achlam kishayiplu. I'm making a t'nai, as long as the jar of honey is hanging from the schach, I'm not going to use it for my tea. But if the jar of honey falls from the schach and now it's laying on the floor, now I want to be able to use it for my honey. So the person is reasoning, he says, look, I understand that there's an issue of bizay mitzvah in using the item that I hung up for noi sukkah to eat from. I understand such a concept. So I want to cut it somewhere in the middle. As long as it's hanging in the sukkah, I'm not going to be mistapik from it. I'm not going to use it because I understand the concept of bizay mitzvah. But I want to make a t'nai, not that I want to go up to the schach and take a teaspoon of honey. No, I don't want to make that t'nai. The t'nai that I want to make is should the jar of honey fall down, so now there really is no more bizui mitzvah, now I want to be able to use it. The Mechaber says, that Tanai won't work. Ain't a klum. That Tanai is worthless. And the reason that Tanai is worthless is very simple. Because you weren't masneh that you're not removing yourself from the jar of honey during Ben Hashmashis. You were only masneh that you're not removing yourself from the jar of honey when it falls. So now what happens when Ben Hashmashis comes? When Ben Hashmashis comes, are you allowed to take that honey? No, because you didn't make a Tanai that covers the time period of Ben Hashmashis. Oh, now since it's Aser Ben Hashmashis, Kevin this Katzoil vis Katzoil Ben Hashmashis is Katzoil Kuliyuma. Once it becomes Aser, once it gets that status that you're not allowed to be mistapik from it because of bizui mitzvah during the Ben Hashmashis period of the first night of Yom Tov, now that status is going to carry through for the entirety of Yom Tov, and it's going to cover even if the jar of honey falls. Now you'll say, but wait a second, even if the jar of honey falls, there's still no bizui mitzvah. If it's laying on the floor, why is it bizui mitzvah? It doesn't matter. That's the din d'Rabbanan, and we're going to see this spelled out by the Mishnah Berurah. Hoyel is katzoil ben hashmashis. We look at the status of that jar of honey by Ben Hashmashis. By Ben Hashmashis, were you allowed to go up to that jar of honey, take a teaspoon of honey for your tea? No, you weren't, because of bizui mitzvah. You made a Tanai, but you didn't make a Tanai for Ben Hashmashis. You only made a Tanai for if it falls down. So by Ben Hashmashis, you weren't allowed to take a teaspoon of honey for your tea. Hoyel v'is katzoil ben Hashmashis, since it was muktzah, and it had this status of a chefsa shel mitzvah and bizui mitzvah during Ben Hashmashis at the beginning of Yom Tov, that is going to carry through is katzai l'chula yuma. It will remain muktzah, and it will carry that status for the entire Yom Tov, even should it fall down. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Let's do some Mishnah Berurahs over here. Ois cotton Tez Zayin on Kuf Beis Amud Aleph. The Mechaber said that you have to make this T'nai b'shah she'tala'am, at the time that you hang up the Sukkah. Now, is that to be taken literally? Must you make the T'nai right before you hang it up? So like you have to hold the jar of honey and say, okay, I'm making a T'nai right now that I'm not separating myself from this jar of honey for all of the Ben Hashmashis of Yom Tov. Is that what you have to do? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. B'shah she'talam, when the Mechaber says that you make the T'nai at the time that you hang up the Sukkah, Bala Afuke, he's coming to contrast the loinema dafka samach l'ben hashmashis. You might have thought that you have to make the T'nai right before the arrival of Ben Hashmashis. Maybe you have to make the T'nai the minute before Shkia. Says the Mechaber, no. You could make the T'nai b'shah she'tala'am. Even if you're hanging up the Sukkah 2 days before Sukkot, you can make the T'nai then. But you don't have to make the T'nai at the time that you hang it. If you hang the Sukkah 2 days before Yom Tov, and you didn't make a T'nai, you can make a T'nai an hour before Shkia on Erev Yom Tov. But you don't have to make it right before Ben Hashmashis. Ois cotton Yud Zayin. The phraseology of the T'nai, the Mechaber said, was, Eini baidal mehen, I'm not separating myself from the Sukkah, kol Ben Hashmashis, for the entirety of Ben Hashmashis. Explains the Chavetz Chaim is cutting Yud Zayin, kol Ben Hashmashis, the yesh tchilas Ben Hashmashis, the yesh soif Ben Hashmashis. The Ben Hashmashis period has a beginning and an end. Ubeinan shelo yivdal mehen kol zman Ben Hashmashis. We have to make sure that when you made your T'nai, you are clear that you're not separating yourself from this item for any part of Ben Hashmashis. So if you would suggest somehow in your phraseology that you're not separating yourself from this item for the last 10 minutes of Ben Hashmashis, okay, but you did separate yourself from this item for the first part of Ben Hashmashis. In Cain, Hoyel v'is katzoil Ben Hashmashis is katzoil kuliyuma. Once the Isser was chal, once the Isser took place on the item for any part of Ben Hashmashis, it will carry through for the rest of Yom Tov. So you have to very clearly state kol Ben Hashmashis, for the entirety of Ben Hashmashis. Ois kan Yudches, the Ramah put in shel shmoina yamim. The Ramah says you have to spell out that you're not It's not that you're not separating yourself from this item just for Ben Hashmashas on the first night of Yom Tov. You're not separating yourself from this item for every single Ben Hashmashas, every day of Yom Tov. Explains the Chavetz Chaim Pirush. La'afuke, this stands in contrast, Kisha Amar, to one who says, Eini Baidel Mehem Kol Ben Hashmashas Shal Erev Yom Tov Arishon. Let's say somebody hangs up the Sukkah, and he says, I'm not separating myself from this jar of honey for Ben Hashmashas of the first night of Yom Tov. That's a problem. Because then what's going to happen is, when it comes to the Ben Hashmashas period of the second night of Yom Tov, the Kedusha, the Muktzah, the status of Chefetz Shel Mitzvah is going to be chal on that jar of honey by Ben Hashmashas of the second night of Yom Tov. And then it will carry through for the entire second day of Yom Tov. And then it will be chal again, Ben Hashmashas, on the third night of Yom Tov, and it will carry through for the entire third day of Yom Tov. The Kedusha will be chal on each subsequent Ben Hashmashas time period of each day of Yom Tov. So now the Noy Sukkah would be forbidden, they would be prohibited, beginning with Ben Hashmashas of the second day Yom Tov through the end of Yom Tov. However, the Chavetz Chaim says, if somebody would make the Tanai, and he would leave out the Ramaz Kol Shmoinas Yamim, and he would just say Eini Baidel Mehen Kol Bein Hashmashas, all of Bein Hashmashas, Efsher the Kol Bazeh Kol Shmoinas Yamim. The Chavetz Chaim says it's possible that using that phraseology, he's actually including every Bein Hashmashas of the entire Yom Tov. Now, it's interesting to me, and if I spent time thinking about it, maybe I would figure out why, but it's interesting to me that the Chavetz Chaim does not have an ois cotton over here for the Shar Tzion, and he doesn't bring this down from the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram says this, and the Magen Avram doesn't say it on his own. So Magen Avram Sif Cotton Zion, the Magen Avram says, V'yam shel shloimei kasav. So this is actually a yam shel shloimei. V'yam shel shloimei kasav, the chumra yiserahi. That this chumra of the Ramaz is a chumra yisera. This is a too great astringency. The Kevin Jamar Stam Eini Baidel Mehem Kol Ben Hashmashas. Once somebody says, I'm not separating myself from the Noy Sukkah, Kol Bein Hashmashas, Kol Ches Yamim B'mashma. The Yam Shel Shloimeh says that clearly covers the all Ben Hashmashas periods of all 8 days of Yom Tov, and you don't have to mamish spell out every Ben Hashmashas. I'm not separating myself from the Noy Sukkah for every Ben Hashmashas for all 8 days of Yom Tov. Okay. Ois cotton yutes. So if somebody made this tonight, then the Mechaber said, Hareza mistapek mehem b'chol eis sheyirtze. Then you could make use of the Noy Sukkah whenever you'd like. So whenever you want a teaspoon of honey for your tea, you could take a teaspoon of honey for your tea. Ois cotton yutes b'chol eis sheyirtze. Pirish. What does it mean b'chol eis sheyirtze? Whenever you want. Afilu kishein tluyin. Even when they're hanging, you could go ahead and take a teaspoon of honey, because that's not Bizay Mitzvah. I didn't designate it solely for the purpose of Noy Sukkah. I was very clear. If I need honey, I'm going to take honey. So then it's not Bizay Mitzvah. The Choshkein da Tanai Mahane Lohanis Ben Kishiyiplu. Certainly the Tanai is effective after the jar of honey falls down on the floor, where there no longer is a concept of Bizay Mitzvah at all. Ois Kat Nechaf, the Mechaber says, no, we didn't do that yet. Okay, let's go back into the Shulchan Aruch. 3 lines down the middle of the line, right by the Ois Kat Nechaf of the Mishnah Berurah. V'im Amar. Let's say somebody makes the Tanai using a little different phraseology than what the Mechaber said. V'im Amar, if somebody says, Ani masna aleim, I'm making a Tanai, I'm making a condition on this Noy Sukkah, la'achla me'masai sheretze, to eat them whenever I want. So he hangs up the jar of honey on Erev Yom Tov, and he says, I'm making it Tanai, I should be able to use this honey whenever I want. But he doesn't say, Eini Baidel Mehen Kol Ben Hashmashas, I'm not separating myself from it for the entirety of Ben Hashmashas. He just says, I'm making it Tanai, I want to be able to use the honey whenever I want. Says the Mechaber Mahani, that works. Why? Very simple why. Shagam ben hashmasha is peklal. Because when somebody says I'm making it tonight, I want to be able to use the honey whenever I want includes the time period of ben hashmashas. It's interesting to me, the Mechaber uses this phraseology last. Now you might wonder, this phraseology is the simplest. Why does the Mechaber suggest first that the Tanai has to be Eini Boidel Mehem Kol Ben Hashmashus, and the Ramah adds in Shal Shmainas Yamim, and I got to know all the technicalities of Hoilvis Katzoyle Ben Hashmashus is Katzoyle Kulayuma, and whether I have to say every Ben Hashmashus or not. This is somewhat simpler. I'm making it tonight. I should be able to use the honey whenever I want. That's somewhat simpler. Why didn't the Mechaber just say that at the beginning? I think the answer is really, you could see the answer for yourself in the Be'er HaGoyla. If you look at Kuf Bey's Amid Aleph, on the bottom line of the Shulchan Aruch, by the words Va'amar, there's a little hay for the Be'er HaGoyla, where the Be'er HaGoyla brings down the source for this phraseology. O Kimta da Abaya v'Rav Hasham. This is a Gemara in Masechtas Bey on Daf Lamed Amid Beis. Those of you who learned Daf Yomi, Yirtzeh Hashem, you should learn it soon in good health. So there you have a Gemara from Masechtas Bey on Lamed Amid Beis. What's the source for this much simpler tonight? So on Kuf Beis Amid Beis, if you look at the Be'er HaGoyla Ois Katan Zayin, this is brought down by the Torah in the name of the Baal Halachas Gedolos. So if you have a choice between a Beferish Gemara and a Bahag, you're going to give the Beferish Gemara first. But the Mechaber did make sure to mention what the Bahag says, because like I said, it's much simpler. Okay, let's go to Ois Katan Chaf in the Mishnah Berurah. V'im Amar, if you make this simpler Tanai, this simpler Tanai is also effective. However, the Chavetz Chaim says, remember, Ma'iri Gamkein Sha'amar B'Shasha Tala'am. You still have to make the Tanai at the proper time. You have to make it B'Shasha Tala'am at the time that you hang the Sukkah, or at least you have to make it before Ben Hashmashas. I'll call Panim Kainu Ben Hashmashas. Okay, now let's go weiter. Let's see the words of the Ramah, 4 lines down in the Shulchan Aruch. Hago. V'tzarech lasais hatanai koydem ben hashmashos harishain. And remember, it's critically important that you must make the Tanai before ben hashmashos on Erev Yom Tov. Now let's just remember, fix in our minds what we saw so far. We saw so far that the Mechaber said, you say, Eini boidel mehem kol ben hashmashos. I'm not separating myself from this item, from this Sukkah, for the entirety of Ben Hashmashas. And the Ramah said you should make sure to say Ben Hashmashas of each day of Yom Tov. And the Chavetz Chaim explained why did the Ramah feel that that was important. Because the Ramah reasoned you might separate yourself from it for Ben Hashmashas of the first day of Yom Tov, but what if you didn't separate yourself from it Ben Hashmashas on the second day of Yom Tov? Then the Yisr will be chal by Ben Hashmashas on the second night of Yom Tov, and it will carry through for the entire second day of Yom Tov. So you see that the Yisr could be chal on every subsequent day of Yom Tov. Now that brings the following question. How about if somebody neglects to make the Tanai? So he didn't make the Tanai when he hung up the Sukkah. He didn't make the Tanai in Erev Yom Tov. So he never made the Tanai before Ben Hashmashas. So now he says to himself, okay, so wait a second. I remember learning in Dirshu that if you made a Tanai only for the first Ben Hashmashas, only for Ben Hashmashas on Erev Yom Tov, and you didn't make the Tanai for the rest of Yom Tov, then what will happen? The Kedusha will be chal on the second Ben Hashmashas, and it will cover the second day. So it sounds to me like each day is a separate entity. So, okay, I forgot to make the Tanai before the first day. But now it's 5 minutes before Shkia on the second night of Yom Tov. So I'll make a Tanai now to cover the second day. Or I'll make a Tanai now, and I'm saying Eini boidel mehen kol ben hashmashas for the rest of Yom Tov. So the Sukkah were also on the first day of Yom Tov, but at least the Sukkah won't be also for the rest of Yom Tov. Could you do that? Could you cut off the first day and treat the rest of Yom Tov as a separate entity? So that's why the Ramah says no. You must make the Tanai before the first Ben Hashmashas of Erev Yom Tov, the first night of Yom Tov. If you don't make the Tanai then, you missed the boat. Says the Chavetz Chaim, why is that? HaTanai Kodim is Katan Chaf Aleph. The Kevin Shenichnas Ben Hashmashos is Katzoi. Because once the first Ben Hashmashos comes, so now it's Muktzah for Ben Hashmashos. And according to what we learned earlier in Hilchos Shabbos, the Ben I'm sorry. Bear with me. First, Chavetz Chaim is making a different point. The Kevin Shenichnas Ben Hashmashos is Katzoi. You must make, this goes back on the Ramah. Ois Katan Chaf Aleph is on the Ramah. The Ramah says you have to make the Tanai Kodim Ben Hashmashos. So first the Chavetz Chaim wants to explain what does before Ben Hashmashos mean. You have to make it before Ben Hashmashos. The Kevit Shenichnas Ben Hashmashos, because once Ben Hashmashos begins, is Katzoi. Now already you have the problem of Muktzah. Muktzah is Chal right away at the beginning of Ben Hashmashos. And according to what we learned in Hilchos Shabbos, in Siman Reish Samach Aleph, the Ben Hashmashos Maskel Tekef Achar Shkia, that Ben Hashmashos begins immediately after Shkia. Tzarich Lases HaTanai Kodim Shkia. Realize this means that you have to make the Tanai before Shkia. Now, Ois Katan Chaf Beis, the Ramah said that it's critical. You must make the Tanai before the first Ben Hashmashos. You must make the Tanai before Ben Hashmashos on Erev Yom Tov, the first night. Why? Because if not, Kevon the Chayli Surah Ben Hashmashos Kama, once the Isser of Bizoi Mitzvah, once the Isser of this Muktzah is Chal on the Noy Sukkah, on the first night of Yom Tov, at the first minute of Ben Hashmashos, Memela Chayil Bekulahu. If it's Chal on the first night, it's Chal for the rest of Yom Tov. The Kiyuma Arichta Dami Le'inyan Zeh. Because it is the entire Yom Tov is considered like a Yuma Arichta, is considered like one long day Le'inyan Zeh, in the context of this concept of Hoyel V'is Katzai. Now it's too late. If you didn't make the Tanai before the first Ben Hashmashos, you can't make the Tanai anymore before the second Ben Hashmashos. Don't think that if the Kedusha is Chal by the first Ben Hashmashos, it only carries through for the first day of Yom Tov. No, if it's Chal on the first Ben Hashmashos, it will carry through for the rest of Yom Tov, because it is all considered Kiyuma Arichta. Now there's a very interesting Sharet Tzion over here. Ois Katan Chaf Gimel. The Sharet Tzion says like this. He brings down from the Taz, the Kavanasai Derak L'Chumra Arinon Zeh. He brings down from the Taz that this concept, that we treat the entire Yom Tov as Yuma Arichta, we only say it L'Chumra. Aval L'Hakel, but we don't say it L'Kula. What would be the manifestation of Kula? Kegoin, for example, Im Amar Eini Beidel Kol Ben Hashmashos Shel Erev Yom Tov Rishon. Let's say somebody would make the following tonight. I'm not separating myself from the Noy Sukkah for the first Ben Hashmashos. So he didn't say, I'm Eini Beidel Mehen all of the Ben Hashmashos, like the Ramah. He didn't even say, like what we learned from the Magen Avraham earlier. He didn't say, I'm separating myself Kol Ben Hashmashos, where we said that might be a problem. The Ramah says that could be a problem, right? Because really you have to separate yourself from every single Ben Hashmashos, otherwise the Kedusha could be Chal on the second day. This guy spelled out clearly, I'm not separating myself from this item for Ben Hashmashos of Erev Yom Tov Rishon. He spelled it out. I'm only making the Tanai for the first Ben Hashmashos. So now what's the halacha? You might be tempted to say, well, we just learned the Ramah over here, and we learned a Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Chaf Beis, who told me that Kiyuma Arichta Dami, that the entire Yom Tov is treated as one long day. So if I made it tonight and I said, I'm not separating myself from the Noy Sukkah for the Ben Hashmashos of Erev Yom Tov Rishon, okay, so once I didn't separate myself from the item for the first Ben Hashmashos, so now it's Kiyuma Arichta Dami. The Kedusha was not Chal Ben Hashmashos on Erev Yom Tov, so now it's not Chal for the rest of Yom Tov. The same way we're saying L'chumra we're saying, if you did not make it tonight, and before the first night, and therefore the Kedusha was Chal on the first Ben Hashmashas, then we're saying it's chal for the whole Yom Tov, because kiyum arichta damya. That's the chumrah. So now let's also apply the kula. If I clearly only separated myself, if I clearly only made the Tanai, I did not separate myself for the first Ben Hashmashas, so it should be effective for the whole Yom Tov, because kiyum arichta damya. The kedusha wasn't chal on the first Ben Hashmashas, it shouldn't be chal for the rest. Says the Sharetzia, no. We say the chumrah, but we don't say the kula. Loi mahani zel inyan shar yomei. The efsher da'atam, the Chofetz Chaim says, could be the rationale why we use the kula, why we use this concept for the chumrah, but not for the kula, is kevan sheyiched va'amar mi bein hashmashas shel erev Yom Tov Rishon. When somebody makes a t'nai and he says, I am not separating myself from this item for the first bein hashmashas. Mashma, the implication is the meshar bein hashmashas mitzayne lived on the end. That carries an implication that I am being maktzeh myself from it on the other ben hashmashas. Guy says clearly, eini boidel mehen ben hashmashas shel erev Yom Tov Rishon. I'm not separating myself from this item. When? For the first ben hashmashas. But for the rest, for the other 7 ben hashmashas, then I am separating myself. That implication is carried in his words, and therefore we can't apply the kula. But the chumrah, we don't have that issue. By the chumrah, if you allowed the kedusha to be chal on the first ben hashmashas because you did not make it tanai, so you allowed it to be chal. Once you allowed it to be chal, you ma'arichta damya, and now there's nothing preventing it from being chal for the rest of Yom Tov. So the chumrah applies, but the kula does not. And he says, "Ukein zeh kasav b'yam shel shlomo." Okay, let's go weiter. I really want to try to finish this Siman in today's share, so let's go weiter. Says the Ramah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down in the middle of the line. Says the Ramah, Yesh ben ha'achreinim shekasu, there are those achreinim that write. The bezman hazeh, nowadays, ein noihagim lahasnois. The Ma'aril says that nowadays we do not have this minig to make this t'nai on the nois sukkah. V'hachi nohud b'noyin atuliyim b'schach. And the Ramah says that indeed is the minig that we have when it comes to nois sukkah that hang from the schach. However, when it comes to nois sukkah that we place on the walls, like the posters that people put up, kigoin, for example, sadinin amitzuyarim, maybe beautiful embroidered tapestries, noihagin l'taltalam mipnei hageshamim. The minig is that we do bring them inside from the sukkah to protect them from the rain. Afilu b'loi tanai, even without a tanai. So he's bringing down here from some achrayim. Some achrayim say that nowadays we don't make a tanai. Why would we not make a tanai nowadays? Says the Chofetz Chaim, mishum deloi b'ki shaper b'tanai. These achrayim say that this tanai, we see this is very, it's very lumdish. We have to be a baki. We have to understand how the tanai works. We're not b'kiyim b'tanai, so we don't make a tanai. However, v'yesh me'achrayim shemefakvekid b'tamzeh. There are achrayim like the Magen Avram brought down in the Sharetzia that argue very strongly on this. They say ta'aloi lashon tanai mefurish b'gemara v'ein shayach b'kiyas. What kind of b'kiyas do we need over here? We have phraseology that is explicitly spelled out in the Gemara. We don't have to be a ganza baki in order to understand what it is. We have a mechaber over here. We have a Baal Halachas Gedolos brought down by the Torah that gave us a very, very simple tonight. I just want to be able to use the jar of honey whenever I want. So what's the bikiyas that we need? Others say that the bikiyas that we need, there is a bikiyas that we need. This is not just phraseology, it's just as words. In order for the Tanai to be effective, you have to understand what the Isser is. You have to understand Ben Hashmashas. You have to understand Ha'ilvis Katzoi is Katzoi. And you have to know what kind of Tanai you're making. You have to understand what the Isser is, and you have to understand the mechanics of your Tanai and why your Tanai works. Otherwise, it's just a formula. It's a little bit similar to what we learned in Hilchas Pesach. In Hilchas Pesach, we learned that when we say Kol Chamira v'Chamia, when it comes to Bittul Chametz, you have to know what you're saying. If you just think it's some kind of heebie-jeebie, it's some kind of magic formula, and you have no idea what the words mean, then when you say Kol Chamira, your Kol Chamira is not effective. That's not a bittul. So he said, the Mishnah Berurah spelled it out to us in Yiddish, if you remember. He actually wrote the Yiddish words of Kol Chamira. He said, if you don't know what it means in Aramaic, don't say it in Aramaic. Say it in Yiddish. You must know what you mean. So it could be that over here as well. It's not just heebie-jeebie phraseology. What if somebody doesn't know Hebrew? What if somebody doesn't know, you're just going to say the words? But even if he knows what the words mean, I'm making a condition I should be able to use the honey whenever I want. Do you know what's preventing you, potentially, from using the honey? Do you know what the isser is? That you're making it tonight that you shouldn't be, that you should be able to use it? Do you understand the concept of muktzah? Do you understand that there's bizei mitzvah, and there's muktzah, and there's a hoil viz katzai, and there's ben hashmashis, and there's a beginning of ben hashmashis, and an end of ben hashmashis, and there's ben hashmashis every day? If you didn't learn Siman Tafresh Lamed Ches, then you don't understand any of this. And then maybe the Tanai is not effective. Okay. Now, the Ramah said that there are achrayim that say that we don't make a Tanai nowadays. The Ramah said that in a Chinami, the Ramah says that's the minig that we have when it comes to Noi Sukkah hanging from the schach. But by Noi Sukkah that's on the walls, he said over there we have a minig that we do take them in to protect them from rain, even if we don't have a Tanai. And if you go back to the Ramah, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines up from the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch in the middle of the line, his rationale to differentiate between the Noi on the walls and the Noi on the schach is Mishum Yesh Oimrim Dein Isser Afilu B'Defanes Atzman. He says, we said in the beginning of Siman Taf Reish Lamed Ches, the Machaber said right away in Sif Aleph that the Isser to be nenef from the materials of the Sukkah is Bein Atzei Defanois, Bein Atzei Schach. It applies equally both to the walls and to the schach. And we didn't learn it, but if you took a look in the Bir Halacha on Kuf Aleph Amid Beis and Dibra Maskal Bein Atzei Tfanis Bein Atzei Schach, he brought down actually a machlokes rishonim. That's the opinion of the Rosh. The Rosh is the one who says that the Defanis don't have an Isser. The Rosh holds that the whole Isser to be nena from the materials of the Sukkah only applies to the schach, not to the walls. The Rambam and the Mechaber Paschals, like the Rambam holds that applies to the walls too. So says the Ramah over here, we have a Rosh who says that the whole Isser doesn't even apply to the walls. So if the Isser of using the materials of the Sukkah doesn't apply to the walls of the Sukkah, are we now going to say that the Isser to be nene from the Noi Sukkah, which is a lesser Isser, it's a lesser of Bizei Mitzvah, it's not the Isser of Kedushas HaSukkah, of the Hekesh Techagiga, are we going to say that that applies to the Noi of the Defanois? That's the rationale of the Ramah. The Yeshaimim De'en Isser Afilu B'Defanois Atzman, Koshkein Manoyin. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Chav Daled. Koshkein Manoyin. Harbe Achrayim Isigu al Zeh. Many Achrayim, and he brings down over here the Magen Avram, Taz, the Gra, they argue on this rationale. The Daitam, and they say, the Noi Sukkah bevadai asurim beloy Tanai Medina. They say that the Noi Sukkah is Asur Min Adin without a Tanai, even the Noi Sukkah of the walls. The Noi Kaschachein, because the Noi has the same din as the Schach. That's the literal translation of the words. But if you look in the Magen Avram and you look at the Machzah Shekel, that's not what it means. The Noi Kaschachein means that the Noi Sukkah, what does the Ramah want to say? The Ramah wants to draw a differentiation between Noi that's hanging on the Schach and Noi that's hanging on the walls. And again, the rationale is the Schach is much more chomer. By the Schach, everybody agrees that there's a hekesh to the Karban Chagiga and the material of the Schach is Asur B'Hana. The walls, there are Rishonim that hold that there's no Isser on the walls at all. So the Noi Sukkah of the walls should be treated more kuladik, it should be treated more leniently than the Noi Sukkah of the Schach. Says the Magen Avram, when it comes to Schach, there's no room for such a differentiation. Is the Noi on the Schach beautifying the Schach and the Noi on the walls beautifying the walls? Not really. All of the Schach has one purpose. All of the Noi has one purpose. The purpose of all of the noi is Zek Keli Van Veyu, to beautify the Sukkah. And the ikar of the Sukkah is the schach. So therefore, the noi kaschachein. The noi on the walls is the same as the noi on the schach. It's all beautifying the Sukkah. And the ikar of the Sukkah is the schach. So there's no room to make a differentiation between noi of the dafanos and noi of the schach. It's all the same. So says the Magen Avram, as the Magen Avram is explained by the Machzah Shekel. Vayin betaz, and take a look at the Taz. The Chofetz Chaim says shehiskim, he agrees lahakel, that we could be mekel besadinim hametzuyarim, when it comes to embroidered tapestries, sheyesh chash mipnei ganovim, where there's a concern that people might come into the sukkah and steal them, that we could be mekel, that you could take them out of the sukkah and bring them inside the house. Why? Anan sadi shaloi tlan l'sham etchila liyosen sham tamid. Because then there's an anan sadi. The words anan sadi mean we testify, we are witnesses. That means it is self-understood that a person who hung a very expensive, beautiful tapestry in his sukkah had no intent to leave it in there. Clearly his intent was that he should be allowed to bring it into the house during Yom Tov. So it's as if he made it tonight. He might have verbalized it tonight, but Anan Sadi, we are witnesses that was his das, and therefore we can be mekel. Al Kain, therefore, lo yiskasu klal, afilu lo yisnu. He wasn't makse it from his das, even if he didn't verbalize it tonight. Nevertheless, says the Chofetz Chaim, it would be better to make it tonight, even by the decorations on the walls, like the Ramah says. Says the Chofetz Chaim weiter. Now he does some housekeeping. He brings up some other issues. Somebody who does have intent to bring in different sukkah decorations into the house, whether he's doing it because of the rain or because of ganovim. So maybe this person made it tonight, or maybe like the Taz, he's mekel because he says there's an anan sadi and you don't even need it tonight. But says the Chofetz Chaim, he brings up a different issue. Yizayar mitchila, he should take care from the outset when he hangs up the noi sukkah, shelo yikshar noyin basukah bekesher gomer, that when he hangs it up, he shouldn't tie a kesher shel kayama. He shouldn't tie a real knot. Shaharei asar lahatiran b'yomtiv, because you want to bring in the noi sukkah on Yom Tov. If you're going to tie a real kesher, so now you can't undo it. Ela yanvev, you should only use a bow. You shouldn't use a real kesher shel kayama, because that would be a chil Shabbos, chil Yom Tov, to undo the knot and bring the noi sukkah in. Weiter. Ein lasais stefanis hasukkah miyariya shatnez. Very interesting thing here. You're making a canvas sukkah. Make sure you should not make the walls of your sukkah out of a type of material that's shatnez, that's a blend of linen and wool. V'chein lo yisle shatnez lanoi. Also, make sure not to hang shatnez tapestries in your sukkah. Ela im kein gavayin mitashvish adam, unless they're so high up that you don't have to worry that a person is going to use them. The problem that we're afraid of over here is we're used to thinking of the Isser of shatnez when it comes to a suit. You're not allowed to wear shatnez. But in Yeridea, it's brought down, you're not allowed to have curtains of shatnez, because we're afraid somebody might go over to the curtain and wrap the curtain around himself. So he's using it like a throw, like a blanket to wrap himself up in, to have hana from the shatnez. That would also be an Isser Daraisa potentially. Is it Daraisa or is it Darabanan? I don't want to be Megalapan B'Torah Shalai Kalach. I'm not sure if it's Isser Darabanan or it's an Isser Torah. But whatever it is, there definitely would be an Isser of shatnez involved in that. So don't hang shatnez tapestries in the sukkah where somebody could come and potentially wrap himself up in it. Continues the Chofetz Chaim. A very interesting Isser over here. Asr lachkoik pasuk basukos teishvu. You're not allowed to engrave the pasuk. Basukos teishvu shivas yamim. You're not allowed to, you want to see what they used to do for Noi Sukkah? You're not allowed to engrave this pasuk into a gourd or into a melon. And then hang it in the sukkah. Why? What are you doing? You're cutting a pasuk into a melon. You're cutting a pasuk into a gourd. And then what's going to happen? It's going to rot. And then you're going to throw it out. So you're writing down a pasuk in an oifen that it's going to come lidei bezayin. This is why the Yeshiva Zatzal, Rav Moshe, was very, very makbid. People write Be'ezras Hashem Yisbarach. They write Baruch Hashem on the top of every paper that they write. The Yeshiva Zatzal was not fond of that minig, because he said, you have a shopping list, you write Be'ezras Hashem Yisbarach, you go shopping, and then you take your shopping list and you throw it in the garbage. So you're writing Be'ezras Hashem Yisbarach, you're writing Baruch Hashem on something that's going to come lidei bezayin. Certainly over here, you're writing a pasuk in an oifen that it's going to come lidei bezayin. Not only that, but look how far the Chavetz Chaim goes. Look what he says next. V'gam, furthermore, she'also lichtoi psukim in HaTorah, you're not allowed to write psukim. You're not allowed to write a pasuk from Chumash, Torah Shebeksav, Eli in Ken Yesh Behen Sefer Shalom. Really, the only heter to write down a pasuk is if you're writing a Sefer Shalom. You want to write down a pasuk, you got to write a whole Sefer of Chumash. K'moishet is Barbi Yeridea Siman Reish Pei Gimel, like it's spelled out the halacha in Yeridea. The reason for this halacha is because when you write down a pasuk, we know that myriad of halachas are learnt out from sukkim, and sometimes the halacha is only learnt out from a pasuk in context of the other psukim. So now you're going to take a piece of paper, you're going to write down one pasuk. Somebody is going to see that pasuk, he's going to learn out a wrong halacha because the pasuk is not in its proper context. That's the original basis for this halacha. And says the Chavetz Chaim, V'afal gav de noyag in heter, even though we're noyag heter, we do write down isolated psukim. You're learning Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, you're writing notes, you're allowed to write down the pasuk Kol Ezrach B'Yisrael Yeshvu Basukkos to remind yourself that a sukkah shel shutvin is mutter, because the pasuk is mashma that Gans Klal Yisrael could be yotze with one sukkah. You're allowed to write down an isolated sukkah. Says the Chavetz Chaim, lehislamed bahen dafka. That's only when you're doing it for learning purposes, for studying purposes. But stam, avol shaloi l'tzorich, but just to write a pasuk shaloi l'tzorich, aser. The Chavetz Chaim says it's aser to write a pasuk shaloi l'tzorich. So you want to write a pasuk for a decoration? You don't write a pasuk for a decoration. Halacha l'maisa, the posters that we have that have psukim on them, I'm not issuing a psak on that. I'm giving a Mishnah Berurah here. And so says the Mishnah Berurah. Seems very clear that Mishnah Berurah would not be happy with somebody writing a pasuk on an oak tag to write it, to hang it up in the sukkah as noi sukkah. You're not allowed to write it stam, just for a decoration. So says the Chavetz Chaim over here. Oid kasvu, the Yachronim also write, da'af achar sukkahs, even after sukkahs, lo yifsa al atzei sukkah. Don't step on the materials of the sukkah. You have 2x4s that you use for your sukkah. You put up a very quick sukkah, 2x4s of plywood. You're not intending on saving it. You're not intending on saving the materials. Next year, you're going to put up a new sukkah. You can't take it and throw it out b'ofen bezayin, and you can't step on the pieces of the sukkah. The tashmishe mitzvah. They are tashmishe mitzvah. Kamay tzitzis v'lulav. It's like the strings of tzitzis that you took off of a beged. That you're not allowed to take those strings and throw them out b'ofen bezayin. So too the Atzei Sukkah. Forget the Isser that we had of Korban Chagiga. That doesn't apply anymore when it's not the time of the mitzvah, after Yom Tov. But you still don't throw it out b'ofen bezayin. You don't take your hadassim and your aravas and throw them out b'ofen bezayin. The tashmishe mitzvah, I burn them with the chametz. If something happened that I couldn't burn them with the chametz, so you throw them in the backyard, you let them fall apart, but you don't throw them out b'ofen bezayin. You put it somewhere where people aren't going to step on them. You should be moicha against people who throw out the atzei sukkah in the place where people will step on them. Even if you're not throwing it into a garbage dump, still, you don't throw it where people are going to come to step on them. Okay, I know we're going a little bit long, but I'm pushing on to finish the Siman. 3 lines from the bottom near the end of the line in the Ramah. Right by the Izkat Chafei for the Mishnah Berurah. If you used hadassim as chach, or you had you're an esrig seicher, so you don't need to put up a plastic esrig. You're going to hang up in the sukkah a real esrig for no sukkah. Mutter lahariach bay. You're allowed to smell the hadas. You're allowed to smell the esrig. The loy huktzah mereach, because when you take hadassim and you throw them up onto the schach, so we just had a whole siman. Now you're not allowed to. Now it's also bano. You're not allowed to use it for anything else. So you are makti it. You designated it for the mitzvah. Are you now allowed to go ahead and allowed to smell it? So first of all, I would just direct you to Kuf Aleph Amid Beis Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Dalid, where the Mishnah Berurah brought down from the Taz that according to the Taz, the whole isser of making use of the Atzei Sukkah is derek bitul shebezet tibatel kedushasa. When you're going to use it, let's say you want to take a piece of wood off the schach to use it for the toothpick. So now when you took it off the schach, you will mevatel its kedusha. It's no longer schach. According to this Taz, this whole Shiloh of the Ramah would seem not to apply, because by smelling the hadas that you're using as schach, you're not being mevatel from its kedusha. That's according to the Taz. The Ramah over here is suggesting that potentially there could be a problem. However, he says it's not a problem. Why is it not a problem? Because what the Ramah is saying is, when you take hadassim and you throw them up to be schach, are you treating those hadassim like hadassim? No. People use bamboo, people use tree branches, people use pine tree branches, anything that's kosher for schach you use for schach. So when you take hadassim and you throw them up on the schach, you're not treating the hadas as a hadas. You're treating it as a tree branch. So when you are makti it midaitoi, when you removed it for any other use, you removed it from tree branch use. You removed it from wood use. You didn't remove it from hadas use. So you weren't makti it from reach, in the context of reach. That's why the Ramah says you're allowed to smell it, and so to the esrig you're allowed to smell. Because you are not makti it from your das in the context of reach. You were only makti it from use, like any other wood. Also betiltul, and you made it also betiltul, but reach is not a problem. However, the Ramah says v'yesh oisrim b'hadas. There are those that do aser the hadas, and they say that the hadas is very significant. Its smell, so you were makti it from the reach. Finally, let's see. Mishnah Berurah is Katan Chafei imsichich b'hadas. Da'af stam hadas oimed lahariach. Even though normally a hadas is oimed lahariach, and therefore you might think that by putting it up as schach, you now removed it from your das in the context of reach, right? Because that's the primary use of a hadas is reach. You were makti it as schach, so you mentally removed yourself from the reach of the hadas. Says the Chafetz Chaim, no. Hacha desichech by using it as schach, k'moi b'shar eitzim, you now treated this hadas like any other piece of wood. Amrina, now we say, say eitzim aktsiye. You are makti yourself from any other wood use. Mileshamesh ulahavir, from using it as a regular wood or burning it as regular wood. V'loy mereichai, but you will not makti it from reach, because you didn't treat it like a hadas. You treated it like regular wood. The inechinami, but the Chafetz Chaim says, let's say you take the hadas and you tape it to the walls of your sukkah for noi sukkah. Now you are treating it as a hadas. Because why did you hang up a hadas? You hung up a hadas because a hadas has a beautiful smell. That's why you hung it in your sukkah. So then, bevadei aktsiye mirechai, then the Pri Megadim says you're not allowed to smell it because you were makti it midas of reach. Esrig, when it comes to an esrig, after talo lenoi, by an esrig, even if you hang an esrig in the sukkah for noi sukkah, mutal or riach, but you're still allowed to smell it. The ikra omed la'achila v'loy lahariach, because the ikra of an esrig is always as food, not as reach. There are those that do aser the hadas in reich if you use it as schach. But an esrig is always mutter to be meriach it if you used it for noi or you used it for schach, because the primary use of an esrig is always achila. The ikra omed la achila umeachila aktsiye, and that's what you removed it from your das. When you used it as schach or you used it as noi, you said I'm not going to use it for eating. But you didn't say, I'm not going to use it for smelling. Thank you for joining me for limud HaTorah. Thank you for bearing with me and going overtime. But I'm not, allow us to fall behind if I could avoid it. So I wanted very much to finish the page. Mr. Hashem will continue with a brand new Siman next time. Thank you for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discuss of limud HaTorah Shivim Began Agans Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua's Refusa Padasa to all those in need, especially now in the Yemei Arachamim. I'm recording this on Sunday morning after the beginning of Slichas, so we are now in the Yemei HaSlichas. The Rebbeinu Shalom should have Rachmanos on Gans Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should protect everyone, and B'yirtzeh Hashem, we should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek B'meherav Yameinu. Amen. Be well.